The war had turned everything into ashes. Cities were silent, filled only with the echo of boots and the crackle of broken roofs. In the middle of this silence, an American soldier named Thomas Reed moved through the outskirts of a small Japanese village. His orders were clear. Secure the area, report movements, trust no one. But when he entered a narrow alley between burned houses, he smelled rice cooking. That smell, so ordinary, so human, stopped him more than any bullet could. Inside a half-collapsed house, an old woman stirred a pot over a weak fire. Her eyes were tired but calm. She looked at Thomas without fear, as if she had already seen enough of death to stop caring who carried a gun. Thomas raised his rifle out of instinct, but then she held out a small bowl toward him. Steam rose from the rice. His stomach twisted from hunger and confusion. The manuals had warned about traps, about civilians who pretended kindness. But this was not in any manual. He took the bowl slowly. The rice was warm, plain, real. The woman spoke softly, words he could not understand, yet her tone carried meaning. She pointed at the sky, then at him, then at herself. It was a gesture of sameness, as if to say we both live under the same sky. Thomas nodded and lowered his weapon. For a brief moment, the war outside seemed to stop breathing. That night he stayed near the house, listening to distant artillery. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen, of the letters he never sent because there were no words for what he had seen. The next morning, when his unit passed through the village, the woman was gone. Only the pot remained, still half full. His sergeant told him to move on, but he pocketed a few grains, pressing them into a piece of cloth. Weeks later, after the surrender, Thomas saw the same gesture again. This time it was a Japanese soldier in rags, held prisoner behind barbed wire. One of the American guards, a boy barely 19, tossed him a handful of rice from his rations. The prisoner caught it, stared at it, and bowed slightly. Thomas recognized the same silence in both moments. The silence of those who had decided to remain human. Years passed. Thomas returned home and built a life that looked whole from the outside. But sometimes, when he cooked rice for his family, he would pause before taking the first bite. He would remember the woman's eyes, the steam, the impossible calm. He understood then that compassion was not weakness. It was rebellion. War had taken away names, faces, and languages, but somewhere behind enemy lines, two people had whispered something stronger than orders. They had spoken the only truth that survived the fire. That even in the darkest corners of war, humanity refuses to die. When the war finally reached the small coastal village of Minato, everything changed overnight. The sky carried the low growl of planes, the sea turned into a graveyard of ships, and the rice fields that had fed generations were now trampled by boots of men who spoke a language the villagers could not understand. Food was scarce, fear was constant, and trust was something no one could afford. Every grain of rice became a matter of survival. One morning, after a long night of air raid sirens and distant gunfire, a young Japanese widow named Aiko went to the edge of her field. She had buried a small pot of rice beneath the soil weeks earlier, hoping to keep it from both thieves and soldiers. As she dug quietly, she noticed movement near the old irrigation ditch. A man in a torn American uniform lay half-conscious, his face pale and burned by the sun. His rifle was gone, his canteen empty, and his lips were dry like cracked stone. He was the enemy, yet he looked no stronger than a child. For a moment she froze. Her brother had been killed months before, somewhere near Okinawa, and every American was a shadow of that loss. She could walk away and no one would ever know. But something in the man's slow, trembling breath stopped her. She unwrapped a small cloth, poured a handful of rice into her palm, and placed it beside him before disappearing into the reeds. The next morning the rice was gone. In its place lay a small piece of chocolate, wrapped in silver paper, the kind children had seen only in stories. Aiko held it in her hands, uncertain if it was a trap or a message. Days passed, and the strange exchange continued. A handful of rice. A ration of chocolate. A flask of water left by the creek. A cigarette she never smoked. They never spoke, yet each gesture said what words could not. When the occupation patrols began to search the outskirts, Aiko realized that helping him was a crime that could cost her everything. One afternoon she saw him again, standing by the field, his face still thin but his eyes alive. He raised his hand in a quiet salute, not of victory but of gratitude. She wanted to say something, but the rumble of approaching trucks forced her to hide. When she looked again, he was gone. Only footprints remained, leading toward the mountains where the American lines were advancing. Months later, when Japan surrendered and American units officially entered the region, Aiko stood among the villagers as they watched soldiers distribute supplies. One man, older now and wearing a clean uniform, looked her way for a brief second. Their eyes met, and in that moment she recognized him. Neither spoke. The air was heavy with silence, but in that silence lay something fragile and human. Years later, an American veteran would tell a reporter about the woman who saved his life with a handful of rice. Her name he never knew, but he remembered the smell of the sea, the sound of distant bells, and the quiet mercy that kept him alive when the world had lost its reason. In the end, the rice that changed hands did more than feed a starving soldier. It fed the last spark of humanity between enemies. It reminded both sides that even in the ruins of war, compassion can survive where armies cannot. The war had rules printed in every soldier's pocket. They were clear, cold, and absolute. Do not fraternize. Do not share supplies. Do not trust the enemy. Yet when Private Samuel Turner stepped into the small coastal village outside Nagasaki in the late summer of 1945, the rules began to fall apart. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that follows disaster, and the smell of burned wood still clung to the narrow streets. What he saw were not enemies. They were people. Thin, tired, and quiet. A mother washing her child's face with a cloth that had once been white. An old man bowing without a word. Children staring at the strange uniform that had taken everything from them. Turner had been told to secure the area, to check every house for weapons, to report any resistance. But there was no resistance. Only hunger. The villagers had rice, but it was almost gone. The Americans had rations, but they were told to keep them. Yet on the third day, as rain began to fall and the mud swallowed the footprints of patrols, Turner did something the manual did not allow. He left a small can of beans on the wooden step of a house where he had seen a young boy watching him from the shadows. The next morning, the can was gone. In its place lay a handful of rice wrapped in paper. No words. No gesture. Just an exchange that said more than any translation could. Across the line of occupation, similar stories quietly unfolded. Marines, medics, and engineers found themselves facing not the enemy they had been trained to hate, but a nation shattered and grieving. Orders still came through, sharp and indifferent. Maintain distance. Maintain control. But the human instinct to connect refused to die. In the southern prefectures, a sergeant was seen teaching a group of children how to repair a broken water pump. In another town, a Japanese widow helped dress the wound of an American soldier who had fallen during a night patrol. Neither of them spoke the other's language, yet both understood the same truth: survival had no uniform. When reports of these encounters reached command, they were dismissed as rumors, distractions, or weakness. Compassion was not part of the mission. The manuals spoke of strategy and control, of victory and surrender, but they never spoke of empathy. The men on the ground learned that in the ruins of war, victory was hollow if humanity was lost. Some of them wrote about it in letters they never sent home, afraid of being misunderstood or punished. Others carried the memory in silence for the rest of their lives. Years later, when historians opened archives and diaries from both sides, they found echoes of the same story. A soldier leaving food for a starving family. A civilian hiding an injured enemy from vengeance. Small, unrecorded acts that crossed the line between enemy and human. These were not stories of peace treaties or grand declarations. They were the quiet moments where war briefly forgot itself. The manuals could not predict that compassion would survive the noise of bombs and the orders of men. It did not fit into strategy or doctrine. Yet it happened, in the corners of ruined villages, in the silence between raids, in the brief exchanges that no one dared to report. The war had ended, but for those who lived through it, the true lesson came not from orders followed, but from empathy chosen. And somewhere in a forgotten village, a handful of rice and a can of beans remained the only proof that enemies can still remember what it means to be human. The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It washed over the burned rooftops and empty streets of a small coastal village in Kyushu. American patrols moved cautiously between the ruins. The war was officially over, yet the air still carried the weight of suspicion and hunger. Lieutenant Thomas Ward led his unit through the mud, his boots sinking into the earth that once held rice fields. Now there were only ashes and the smell of decay. He had been told the civilians might resist, that loyalty to the emperor ran deeper than fear. But when he looked at the villagers, he saw only exhaustion. In one house they found an old woman kneeling by a broken stove. She did not flinch when the soldiers entered. She looked at them with hollow eyes, then pointed to the pot on the floor. Inside were a few grains of rice and boiled weeds. Ward felt something shift in him. The manuals he had read before landing in Japan were clear. Civilians were to be treated with caution. Food was to be rationed. No unnecessary contact. Yet as the old woman trembled, he reached into his pack and placed a small tin of rations beside her pot. No one spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence between them. That night, when the patrol returned to camp, a group of villagers appeared near the edge of the perimeter. They carried small baskets wrapped in cloth. The interpreter warned it could be a trap. But when the soldiers approached, the villagers bowed and placed the baskets on the ground. Inside were handfuls of rice, some still warm, mixed with herbs and bits of fish. Ward felt confusion more than relief. These were people who had lost everything to the bombings. Yet they had chosen to share their last food with men who once bombed their towns. Days passed and the exchanges continued. No one wrote them down. No orders were given. Soldiers left canned meat or sugar on doorsteps. Villagers returned with rice balls or tea. It was not spoken of in reports or letters home. Both sides knew that what they were doing broke rules written by men far from the smell of death. Still, it happened quietly, as if the act itself was a way to rebuild something beyond victory or surrender. One evening Ward met the old woman again. She was standing near the remains of her garden, her hands muddy from digging. She held out a small wooden bowl and gestured for him to take it. Inside was rice cooked with what little she had. He wanted to refuse, but her eyes left no room for pride. He ate slowly, tasting the bitterness of the earth and the salt of her effort. She nodded once and turned away, leaving him alone with a feeling he could not name. Weeks later new orders arrived. The patrol was to move north. The villagers gathered as the trucks started their engines. No words were exchanged. Only a few quiet bows. Ward looked back and saw the old woman standing at the edge of the road. In her hand, she held the empty tin he had given her weeks before, now polished clean. She lifted it slightly, as if returning something that had never truly belonged to either of them. When the unit drove away, Ward wrote in his journal that night. He did not mention the rice, or the woman, or the silent exchange that had bridged the space between enemies. He simply wrote that for a brief time in a ruined village, the war had felt distant, as if it had paused to let two sides remember what it meant to be human. He closed the notebook, placed it under his pack, and listened to the sound of rain against the canvas roof. It was the same rain that fell on the village, on the soldiers, and on the graves of those who would never see peace. A silent pact had been made, not with signatures or promises, but with small acts that defied the noise of history. It was a fragile truth that lived in the space between hunger and compassion, between duty and forgiveness, between occupier and occupied. The war was over, yet the silence that followed was heavier than the sound of guns. Villages in southern Japan lay in ruins, their wooden homes turned to ash and dust. Among the wreckage, the smell of burnt rice fields hung in the air like a memory of hunger. American soldiers patrolled narrow dirt roads between broken houses, their rifles slung low, their faces uncertain. The manuals told them to be cautious, to trust no one, to keep their distance. But the manuals did not mention what to do when a starving child reached out a trembling hand. Private Andrew Miller had landed only weeks earlier. His orders were clear, but his conscience was not. On his first patrol through the outskirts of Kagoshima, he met an old woman standing by a collapsed gate. She bowed slightly, her eyes dark and hollow. In her hands she held a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He thought it was a trap at first, his finger tightening on the trigger. But when she opened it, he saw rice, precious, white, still warm from the pot. She extended it toward him, her voice barely a whisper. No one translated, but the meaning was clear. He took it, confused, ashamed, grateful. His rations were dry and tasteless, but this felt different. His comrades laughed later, called him soft, said she was only trying to save herself. Yet that night, as rain dripped through the holes in the barracks roof, Miller could not forget her face. He wondered what kind of mercy could survive defeat. Days passed. The soldiers grew used to the quiet streets and the careful eyes watching from behind paper walls. Some bartered cigarettes for vegetables, others traded sugar for news. Officially, such exchanges were forbidden. The command feared sympathy more than sabotage. But hunger made rebels of them all. In another corner of the same village, a farmer named Kenji tried to keep his family alive. His fields had been burned in the bombing, his tools melted, his sons lost. When the Americans arrived, he expected cruelty. Instead, one of them, tall, silent, with tired eyes, offered him a can of meat. Kenji hesitated, then nodded. That night, his wife boiled rice with the meat and left a small portion outside their door. By morning, it was gone. What began as fear became a quiet rhythm. Each night, rice and rations changed hands in secret. Each side told no one, afraid of judgment from their own people. To feed the enemy was betrayal. To accept food from the enemy was shame. Yet both did it, again and again. Months later, Miller's unit was reassigned. Before leaving, he walked back to that same gate. The old woman was there, sweeping dust from her doorstep. He tried to thank her, but his Japanese was broken. She smiled anyway and placed a small pouch in his hand. Inside was uncooked rice, a handful only, but clean and carefully tied. He carried it home across the Pacific. Years later, when he opened his trunk in a small house in Ohio, the pouch was still there. The rice had yellowed with time, but he never threw it away. He told his children once that it came from a place where enemies shared their last meal. Kenji, too, would tell his grandchildren about the soldier who never spoke and never took more than he needed. He would say that guilt and kindness are neighbors in times of ruin. The war taught both men how fragile victory is, and how easily humanity can survive beneath its ashes. The manuals had been wrong. The enemy did not always wear a uniform. Sometimes, he was the one who kept you alive. In the autumn of 1945 the war had ended but the wounds were still open. The small coastal village of Miyako lay silent under the gray sky. Many of its wooden houses were gone, burned or crushed by bombings. The air smelled of damp earth and ashes. The people who survived avoided the main road where American patrols passed. No one wanted to be seen, no one wanted trouble. Private Daniel Carter had arrived only weeks earlier. He was 23 years old and carried more fear than anger. He had seen too many faces disappear in the jungles of the Pacific. He was told that the Japanese could not be trusted, that kindness would only get him killed. Yet the silence of the village did not feel like hatred, it felt like exhaustion. One morning while on patrol, Daniel saw an old man struggling to lift a bucket from a well. The man's hands shook and the rope slipped. Daniel hesitated. His orders were clear: no contact with civilians, but the man was so thin that his ribs showed through his shirt. Daniel stepped forward, reached for the bucket and pulled it up. The old man froze, staring at him with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Daniel nodded and placed the bucket beside him. The man bowed low, murmuring a word Daniel did not understand: arigato. The next day a small bundle appeared outside the patrol hut. Wrapped in cloth lay a few handfuls of rice and a single dried fish. No one admitted leaving it. The sergeant warned them not to touch it, but Daniel knew it was the old man's way of saying he remembered. Over the following weeks the tension began to shift. Villagers started to appear at the edge of the fields again. Women carried water from the river. Children watched from behind broken fences. Soldiers who once pointed rifles now nodded in passing. A fragile rhythm returned like breath after a long night. One evening rain fell in slow, heavy drops. A young woman approached the road holding a small basket. She looked barely 20. Her hands trembled as she extended it toward Daniel. Inside were rice balls wrapped in seaweed. Daniel looked back at her, unsure if this was a trap or an offering. She lowered her head, waiting for him to take it. He did. She stepped back quickly and disappeared into the shadows. He tasted one piece. It was plain and cold, but it felt like the first real meal he had had in months. In his report Daniel wrote nothing about the rice or the people. He wrote about weather patterns and road conditions, but at night he wrote letters to his mother describing the quiet gestures that spoke louder than any command. He told her how the villagers bowed not because they feared him but because they wanted peace. By winter the soldiers began to help repair the village school. They shared canned food in exchange for tools and stories. The language barrier was strong but the meaning was simple. Both sides were tired of hate. The laughter of children returned, faint but real, echoing through the ruined streets. Daniel often stood at the edge of the sea watching fishing boats crawl back into the bay. The old man from the well would wave from the shore. Sometimes they worked side by side without words. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as if they both understood that every nail, every plank was a step away from the war. Months later, when the unit prepared to leave, Daniel walked through the village one last time. The people bowed again, but this time their eyes met. His fear was gone, replaced by something steady and quiet. The old man pressed another small bundle of rice into his hands. Daniel did not refuse. He bowed in return. As the truck rolled away he looked back at the fading shapes of the houses, the smoke rising gently into the cold morning sky. He realized that in the ruins of everything that was lost they had found something that no victory could give: understanding, not written in orders but born in silence, shared between those who had every reason to hate and chose instead to trust. The letters were written in a trembling hand on thin paper that smelled of smoke and seawater. They were never meant to be read by anyone outside the family, yet decades later they reveal a different kind of battle, one fought not with rifles but with conscience. Private Daniel Hayes was stationed on a small island in southern Japan, part of the American occupation force in 1946. He expected hostility, sabotage, hatred from a defeated people. What he found instead were villagers who had nothing left but still bowed to strangers in uniform and offered rice from their own scarce supply. One evening a storm tore through the coast, washing away parts of the supply depot. The soldiers were stranded without food for days. Hayes wrote that a group of local women appeared at dawn carrying bamboo baskets filled with cooked rice and dried fish. He hesitated to take it, ashamed of his weapon hanging from his shoulder, yet they insisted, smiling with the quiet endurance of those who had already lost everything. That night he shared the same rice with his unit and said it was the best meal he had ever eaten because it tasted of guilt and gratitude at once. In his letters home he did not speak of victory or duty. He wrote of a boy who helped him repair a broken jeep using wire and scraps of tin, of a fisherman who saluted the American flag every morning out of habit, of a girl who traded flowers for chocolate wrappers because she had never seen bright colors before. Each story carried the same message hidden between the lines: war had ended but the need to be human had not. Months later Hayes received orders to relocate. Before leaving he returned to the village to say goodbye. The women who had shared rice stood in silence as he handed them a small tin box filled with medical supplies and a note written in clumsy Japanese that said simply, "Thank you for feeding the enemy." He never saw them again. When his letters were found among family papers long after his death, the words seemed almost unbelievable. There were no heroic tales, no medals mentioned, only quiet gestures that defied the logic of war. His final line read, "I came to occupy their land but they occupied my heart with their kindness." Historians later compared his letters with official occupation reports that spoke only of discipline and order. Between those two versions of history lies the truth of that fragile time when enemies became human for a brief moment before the world moved on. The wind carries the smell of burned earth across the valley where the wooden houses once stood. Years have passed, but the soil still hides stories no one dared to tell. In a forgotten village near Nagasaki, an old notebook was found under the floorboards of a ruined home. Its pages are stained with soot and sweat. They belong to Hiroshi Tanaka, a farmer who survived the war and recorded moments that never made it to official reports. He wrote about the day when American soldiers arrived, their boots sinking into the wet fields, their rifles ready but their faces pale and tired. Hiroshi expected anger. Instead, he saw confusion. The soldiers were hungry and afraid, no different from the men who once marched under the rising sun flag. One night, a young soldier knocked on his door. He did not speak much. He simply pointed to his empty canteen and to the small sack of rice hanging by the wall. Hiroshi hesitated, then poured a handful into the soldier's hands. The man bowed slightly and disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, Hiroshi found a small piece of chocolate wrapped in silver foil left on the doorstep. It was the first sweet his children had tasted in years. Weeks later, the village saw the same soldier again, this time helping locals rebuild a bridge destroyed by bombs. No one gave him orders. He just picked up a shovel and joined the men in silence. Hiroshi's notes described this moment not as a miracle but as something simple and human, something that made no sense during war yet made all the sense in peace. The notebook also mentions another man, Corporal James Miller from Ohio. His diary was found decades later in a military archive, full of dust and forgotten letters. He wrote about a farmer who shared his food when orders told him to stay distant. Miller questioned the purpose of victory when compassion felt more powerful than conquest. His handwriting grew shakier with every page, but the words stayed clear. When historians compared both diaries, they realized the two men had written about each other without ever knowing their names. Their stories mirrored the same night, the same act of quiet defiance against the madness around them. What they left behind was not proof of heroism but a fragment of truth buried in dust and memory. It is a reminder that even when nations clash and cities fall, the human heart sometimes chooses a different path. The rain fell in slow heavy drops on a village that no longer had a name. The war had burned away its signs and its pride. Among the ruins an old woman carried a small wooden bowl filled with rice that she had saved through months of hunger. On the road outside the village an American soldier sat by the roadside bleeding from a wound that was already dark and wet. He was her enemy. She had seen men like him burn her home and take her son away. Yet as she looked at him trembling and pale she saw not a soldier but a boy who could not have been older than her own child. She looked around for patrols. The occupation order was clear. Civilians were forbidden to approach enemy soldiers. Anyone found giving food or aid would be punished. Still she stepped forward. The soldier lifted his rifle weakly but lowered it again. Neither of them spoke. She placed the bowl before him and backed away. He stared at it as if it were a trap. Then he ate slowly, tears mixing with the rain. A few days later the soldier returned with a piece of canned meat from the camp ration. He left it near her doorway at dawn and disappeared into the fog. The exchange became silent routine. Each risked their life with every gesture. Every mouthful was an act of defiance against orders written by men who would never stand in that mud. Rumors began to spread. Others in the village followed her example. A few soldiers did the same, leaving medicine or blankets behind fences at night. The commanders tried to stop it with threats and punishments, but hunger and empathy proved stronger than fear. When the war finally ended the woman never saw the soldier again. But years later a letter arrived in her village written in clumsy Japanese. It said, "Only thank you for seeing me as a man when the world told us to be monsters." She folded the letter and placed it beside the wooden bowl now cracked and faded. The forbidden acts of mercy had not changed the outcome of the war, but they had saved something that war could not destroy. The quiet proof that even when ordered to hate, some people still chose to be human. The sun rose over the shattered fields near Nagasaki, casting long shadows across a land that had forgotten what peace looked like. The farmer, Hiroshi, walked slowly through what was left of his rice paddies. The soil was dry, poisoned by ash and fear. He carried a small sack of rice on his back, a harvest barely enough for his family. But that morning he saw movement near the broken fence. A man in a torn American uniform struggled to stand, clutching his side where a piece of shrapnel had lodged. The Marine's name was Thomas Miller. He was far from his unit, lost after a night of gunfire and confusion. For a moment they stared at each other in silence. Hiroshi's hands trembled, not from fear but from memory. He had lost his brother to a bomb dropped by men dressed like this. Thomas raised his hand slowly, not in threat but in surrender. His lips moved without sound. Hiroshi did not understand the words, but he recognized the look in the soldier's eyes, the raw exhaustion of someone who had seen too much death. Hiroshi hesitated. Helping an enemy could mean execution if the patrols found out. Yet the man before him was barely more than a boy, his face gray from pain and hunger. The farmer lowered his sack, took a handful of rice, and placed it on the ground between them. Thomas blinked, unsure if it was a trick. Then he nodded and took one grain at a time as if it were sacred. For 2 days the farmer hid the Marine in a small shed behind his house. He cleaned the wound with boiled water, fed him what little food remained, and said nothing to his neighbors. They could not share a language, but they shared silence. At night they listened to the distant rumble of engines and the soft weeping of the wind over the empty fields. When the American recovery team finally came, Hiroshi guided them from a distance. Thomas wanted to thank him, but there were no words strong enough. Before leaving, he pressed a small metal cross into the farmer's hand. Years later, Hiroshi's grandson would find it hidden in a wooden box wrapped in paper that smelled of smoke and soil. It was not a symbol of victory or surrender. It was proof that even in war, a man could still see another man, not as an enemy, but as a reflection of his own fragile humanity. The rain had stopped, leaving the narrow dirt road slick and glistening beneath the gray sky. American Corporal James Walker adjusted his helmet and stepped carefully past the burned-out shell of a farmhouse. Around him, the small Japanese village lay silent except for the distant crow of a rooster and the faint crackle of a cooking fire. The war had ended weeks ago, but the air still carried the weight of fear and suspicion. Every glance, every sound felt like a memory that refused to fade. At the edge of the village, an old man appeared, bent under the weight of a wooden bucket filled with rice. He moved slowly, eyes fixed on the ground, his bare feet sinking into the mud. Walker raised his hand, signaling him to stop. The man froze. For a long moment, neither spoke. They stood there, two survivors of the same war, neither certain what peace truly meant. Walker had been told to maintain distance, to stay alert, to trust no one. The orders from command were clear: treat civilians with restraint but caution. Yet hunger gnawed at him and his men. Supplies were late, and their rations had run out 3 days ago. He looked again at the bucket of rice, the steam rising faintly in the damp air. The old man hesitated, then lifted the bucket slightly forward, as if offering it. Without a word, Walker stepped closer. The old man's hands trembled as he passed the bucket over. The corporal nodded once, slowly, unsure how to show gratitude in a language he did not speak. He motioned toward the nearby barn where children peeked from behind a cracked door. Walker took a handful of rice, then carefully placed it back, leaving most of it untouched. A young Japanese boy stepped forward, his small hands clutching a tin cup. Walker knelt, poured a little rice inside, and smiled faintly. The boy's eyes widened, not in fear but confusion, as if trying to understand why the enemy would give back what he needed to survive. That night, the soldiers shared their portion with the villagers. No words, no deals, only quiet gestures and the sound of rain returning. In the faint glow of lanterns, Walker watched the old man sit beside his family. For the first time since he landed on these shores, the corporal felt something he could not explain. War had made enemies out of strangers. Hunger had made humans out of them again. The night was still, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind against the shattered windows. Private Daniel Moore sat outside a burned farmhouse on the edge of a Japanese village. His rifle rested beside him, but his hands were empty, trembling slightly as he watched the horizon glow with the last traces of fire. The war was still going on, but something inside him had already stopped fighting. He had seen too many faces, too many children staring at him not with hatred, but with quiet confusion. Earlier that day, his unit had entered the village searching for supplies. What they found instead were families huddled in silence, the smell of boiled rice drifting from a single pot shared among dozens. An old man had stepped forward and, without a word, offered Daniel a small bowl. The rice was cold, sticky, and real. For a long moment, Daniel did not know what to do. His orders were clear: do not trust, do not engage, but hunger and exhaustion spoke louder than command. He took it. That night, he watched that same old man carry a bucket of water to a wounded Marine lying near the road. No one stopped him. The soldier did not resist. It was as if both men had forgotten which side they belonged to. For a brief instant, the line between enemy and friend disappeared. In the following days, Daniel noticed small gestures repeated again and again: shared rice, exchanged glances, silent help. The villagers gave food they could barely spare. The soldiers left cigarettes, bandages, sometimes just a nod. None of this was written in orders. It was a quiet rebellion against hate, carried out by men and women too tired to keep the war alive inside them. When the ceasefire was finally announced, Daniel felt no relief. The paper said the fighting had ended, but for him, it had ended long before. It ended in that small act of kindness, in that bowl of rice passed between strangers who should have despised each other.